Designer notes subject 54. This video is brought to you in part by Starking. You get what you paid for. How many times have you heard that? Typically, that sentence comes after something is bought for relatively cheap and then followed by the realization of what made it so affordable. But how many times have you heard of the phrase more for less? With the Starking AM0162, this is just one of those times. Starking is a Chinese watch manufacturer that's gaining popularity with its exceptionally affordable range of timepieces. They generally use popular design aesthetics while being powered by mass-produced Japanese movements. The AM0162 is an example of this value production, and when we say value, we do mean value. Like, comment, and subscribe for content you'd like to see next. Follow us on Instagram at Design Atelier Aruba for behind-the-scenes content. Submit your pics and videos to designatelierviewer@gmail.com. The case dimensions are 42mm without the crown and 49mm from lug to lug. The thickness is about 12mm including the crystal. The lug width is 20mm, ideal for replacing with other straps and bands. This bracelet does not taper, so it's the same 20mm all around the wrist. The watch is merely 50 meters water resistant, but that's acceptable for its looks and use. These are definitely not tool watches. This watch is powered by a Japanese caliber, the Miyota 82S7 automatic movement. This would run at 42 hours on a full wind and beats at a modest 21,000 beats per hour. It's also accurate to around 20 to 40 seconds per day, decent enough for a value timepiece. It has a unidirectional winding rotor and 21 jewels. This movement is non-hacking, but it is capable of hand winding. The overall presence is subtle and subdued. This is due to the black PBD coating. Most black watches tend to do this. There's generally less glimmering and shimmering. If you want the conventional steel case, you have 3 models to choose from. This black version may ooze subtlety, but that doesn't mean it lacks interesting visual cues. There is enough to see here without being too flashy or asking for attention. The case shows a good amount of contrast between the brushed and polished areas. This plays with the light very well in tandem with the polished bezel. With the simplistic case, all the focus moves to the dial. There is an interesting mix of markers and textures. There are various printed scales around the dial, below the indexes, and within the 2 subdials. It can be argued that a couple of them are not really needed, but it's negligible enough to let it slide. There are ample reminders of the specifications around this dial as well. The 21 jewels, 60 seconds, and sapphire prints reminds everyone of what they are paying for, and there is much to be had indeed. With all of that out of the way, everyone can appreciate the class on display with this dial. The tapestry texture under the Starking logo is very pleasing to the eyes, and elegantly framed with a matted stepped ring under the indexes. Speaking of the indexes, they are finely polished and applied around the dial. There are varying lengths depending on the area of skeletonization. There are even jewel settings at the 12, 3, and 6 o'clock positions. There are other more significant applications here, namely the running seconds and the 24-hour frames. These applied windows are beautifully decorated with circular lines and contrasting white rings. It's nice to see that even the numerals are actually embossed numerals and not merely printed on. This detailing is to showcase the gilded movement underneath this dial. It's a joy to watch a working escapement under the open heart setup. Notice too that this window is gorgeously lined with a mirror polished anglage. This is an incredible detail for a watch of this value. The hands are fairly plain, but both the hour and minute hands are nicely loomed. Something to like about these hands is that it matches the motif of the applied indexes. These dual-edged polished hands and indexes place with reflections admirably. All of these details are very much visible from the anti-reflection coated sapphire crystal. This feature of the watch is another unbeatable value from this Starking model. Continuing with the contrast we saw on the case, the bracelet comes to life on its own by having both the polished and brushed finishes of this PBD coated bracelet. The links are all equally sized and comfortable to the wrist. All of the links are also solid, a definite plus. This is held together with a very good quality butterfly clasp. This mechanism is remarkably better than even some of Seiko's offerings at a higher price range. With the non-tapering 20mm bracelet, the watch has a big impression on the wrist. The overall design is reminiscent of popular classy watches that can be worn both in formal or casual occasions. It's a tried and true formula that appeals to the current generation. But this AM0162 takes it a step further with quality materials and reliability at no extra charge. In line with quality, the case back of this watch can be considered as a major feature. There are no complex engravings on this case, but it does have some clear and crisp laser etching. There is a beautiful mirror polish around the display case back, coupled with a circular brushed finish under the engravings. Through the display crystal, we can gaze at the gilded Miyota caliber movement under the equally gilded Starking logo. Notice too that this Starking logo is printed underneath the crystal. It's a treat to see a decorated movement, especially when it's so visible like this one. The Côte de Genève stripes are in full display, front and center. The rotor is also appropriately skeletonized so you can enjoy the details of the movement. We've come to the very reason this video was made, the value proposition for a Starking timepiece. It would be boring to simply say that this watch is the better or best valued automatic watch available right now. But let's make a design-oriented exercise. Let's try and build a watch that could compete against the AM0162. We made a list of key components for a similar spec automatic watch. Let's say we bought a Miyota 82S7, which is probably decently had for $45. Sapphire crystal would go for $35 normally. Then let's put on a dial at around $15. And let's spend a little bit less with the steel case at $10, bracelet at $10, and an additional $10 for hands, indexes, and printing. You do the math. We're already looking at $125 if we sourced out all of the components ourselves. That's not really bad considering that we're getting a respectable movement and a sapphire crystal on our watch. This Starking, however, can be had for a mind-boggling $75 as of the making of this video. This can be attributed to a large volume production, a common Chinese practice. Simply put, the more a component is produced, the cheaper it'll cost. Cheap here is used only at a monetary level. With the sapphire crystal, finely built dial, and reliable Japanese movement, the quality is better than many competing products. Compared to a Japanese brand such as the Orient Bambino, there is a clear disparity of quality as well. The Bambino is about $30 more expensive. No sapphire crystal, no display case back, no steel bracelet. Next, let's compare this to a similar looking popular brand that uses the same movement, the Bulova Classic Open Heart. We see some striking similarities, of course, mainly with the subdials and the tapestry texture. This Bulova, however, offers no steel bracelet, only a mineral crystal, and costs twice as much as the AM0162. Do you see the pattern here? How is Starking able to do this? Well, they focus on the parts that the watch consumers enjoy and save up on the rest. In person, the dial, crystal, and movement are truly quality-oriented. While Orient and Bulova used inferior materials on these major parts, Starking made sure that these became its selling point. The brushing on the case and bracelet, though, are clearly machine-produced. These are the areas that I feel they cut corners. That is all well and good, considering these are the parts that most people would care less about. It's a noteworthy value for quality materials and aesthetics. The Star King AM0162 surprisingly delivers with very negligible compromises. The Star King brand is making a compelling argument as to why we even buy watches. There are many facets and reasons, of course, each to his own. On the value and quality side of these arguments, Star King deserves to be mentioned at the very least. Honestly, I was a bit skeptical at first on how I'm going to review this Chinese brand. I was burned far too many times after owning and selling many Chinese watches before. Now I'm seriously convinced that our perception about Chinese watches should actually change. They are now producing top quality pieces at smaller markups, which is the exact opposite of many Swiss brands that we often complain about. You paid for the brand, you paid for the heritage, you paid for R&D. You've heard of those before. Isn't it refreshing to actually hear you paid for great quality and design for under 80 bucks? Sounds nice to me.